America's declaration of war on Germany and other Central Powers, including Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Turkey, was a result of Germany's actions taken against the American merchant ships and neutral parties. This caused economic advancements and shifts in the American economy.
The attacks against American ships, in spite of neutral agreements such as the Sussex Pledge, forced President Wilson to take action in order to protect his country's welfare and aid in the defeat of the Central Powers, using economic improvements and a heightened war effort. After the United States entered the war, they weren't able to supply their own weapons, ammunition, and fighting planes, all was supplied by Great Britain and France. Of the 8.8 million rounds shot by the Americans during the war, only 8,000 were made in the U.S. The U.S. also struggled with organizing an army for the war. 6 months after war was declared, training had just started for the draftees, and competition between bureaus created conflict. As for President Wilson's new freedom, it had no position in the wartime economy. With the railroads under government control, business was less efficient. Luckily, Wilson helped the railroads become part of a single system, improving their efficiency. When the U.S. entered the war, Wilson, being the war leader, was unable to juggle all of the tasks given: distribution of scarce materials, standardized production, fixed prices, and coordination of all purchases made between the U.S. and Allied forces, all while leading the Army in the war. Due to his inability to accomplish all these tasks, all the responsibilities were handed over to the WIB. Its duty was to deal with the purchasing of war supplies. As a result of the Army taking so many recruits from the labor market and workforce, and the dramatic reduction of incoming immigrants from more than 1 million in 1905 down to less than 250,000 a year during wartime, the issue of unemployment became almost non-existent. The decrease in immigration was a result of the changes occurring in the relationship between the United States and Europe, as well as new legislative policies created to cap and control immigration during wartime. However, the cost of living soared. Although people with fixed incomes faced hardship, the economic boom created unprecedented opportunities in America during this time. Early in the conflict, industry began weaving itself more tightly into the war effort. Government regulation of wages and working hours of laborers, building army camps, and producing uniforms for soldiers. Disadvantaged groups, especially blacks, were attracted to the jobs in the big city factories such as the steel industry. The steel industry reflected the improvements of working conditions which occurred during World War I. Wages of unskilled workers more than doubled, and thousands of blacks flooded into steel towns from the South. In April 1918, Wilson created the National War Labor Board, headed by William H. Taft and Frank P. Walsh, to settle labor disputes. The board prevented many strikes. The War Labor Policies Board, chaired by Felix Frankfurt, set wage and hour regulations for war industry workers. In response, the unionization of workers was speeded up, and union membership rose by 2.3 million during the war. By 1918, union organizers went all in attempting to unionize the industry, convinced that in order for the world to be safe for democracy, it was necessary to establish an economic and political democracy, which went hand in hand with one another. Although union membership rose by 2.3 million during the war, wartime emergency raised the public against strikers. Some conservatives even demanded that war workers such as soldiers be conscripted. The Selective Service Act, enacted May 18, 1917, was created to authorize the federal government to raise a national army for the American entry into the war through conscription. It was brought to President Woodrow Wilson's attention after a break in relations with Germany in February 1917. The mobilization of the Army required cooperation between both business and military. To get the two groups to work with one another, Wilson helped create the foundation of the industrial military complex in the WIB. The industrial military complex served as the alliance between business and military leaders. Although many attempts were made in getting these groups to cooperate with one another, it took a while to create an efficient system in industrial mobilization. As for the mobilization of agricultural resources, the issue was quickly solved. It came at the perfect time, especially since the British Army only had 6 weeks left in food supply for their troops. Wilson placed Herbert Hoover as the head of the Food Administration. Hoover purchased all of the American and Cuban sugar crop to distribute to American and British refiners. He organized a campaign that promoted consumers to conserve their food voluntarily. The public responded patriotically to Hoover's campaign. Boy Scouts made their own vegetable gardens, chefs used recipes excluding scarce items, and restaurants bought cheap meats and gave out small amounts of sugar and butter. The public wanted to help conserve food to send more to the troops. As for food exports during this time, they increased from 12.3 million tons to 18.6 million tons, and this helped increase incomes by 30%. American involvement in the Great War in Europe resulted in the advancement of the American war industry, as well as the industrial organization which goes hand in hand with the improvements of working conditions and living standards of unskilled laborers as well as disadvantaged groups. In an effort to protect American nationalism and defeat the Central Powers, the U.S. supported the Allied powers with food, munition, and money. The United States experienced internal improvements which ultimately bettered the economy and political states of the United States in respect to both internal and international affairs.